Hello.
Our story starts on a bright, sunny morning as I stood by the kitchen counter, humming while I packed snacks into a large picnic basket. It was a day we'd all been looking forward to, a long-awaited family trip to the amusement park. The kind of trip we used to take when Eric, my son, was just a child. Now, at 21, he's grown into a young man, tall and strong, with a confidence that both amazed and occasionally unsettled me. I could hardly believe how fast the years had flown by. My husband, Dan, had suggested this getaway, saying it would be good for all of us to reconnect and have some fun. Life had become so busy lately, and this felt like a chance to catch our breath. It was meant to be a weekend filled with laughter, cotton candy, and roller coasters. But I had no idea that this trip would shift the way I saw my own family, and myself, forever. We piled into the car, a mixture of excitement and the familiar comfort of being together. Eric sat in the back, scrolling through his phone but occasionally looking up to share a smile. I noticed how his eyes lingered on me, longer than usual, with a warmth that made my heart race for reasons I couldn't quite understand. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the joy of the trip. As we arrived at the amusement park, the smell of popcorn and the sound of laughter filled the air. We spent hours darting between rides, playing silly games, and indulging in sugary treats. It felt like a time capsule back to when Eric was a little boy, tugging at my hand and begging for one more ride. Now it was him leading the way, looking back to make sure I was keeping up. Around midday, Dan decided to take a break and relax in the shade, leaving just Eric and me to explore the park together. We made our way to the Ferris wheel, the iconic ride we always saved for last. As the wheel turned, carrying us high above the park, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. It was just the two of us suspended in the sky, with the world stretching out below. "You've always been here for me, haven't you?" Eric said quietly, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "Of course," I replied, smiling. "That's what moms do." His gaze was intense, filled with something deeper, almost searching. "It's more than that," he continued. "You've been more than just a mom to me. You've been everything." A strange shiver ran down my spine. The words were tender, yet they carried an undercurrent of something else, something that made my pulse quicken. I laughed it off, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, I am your mother. It's kind of my job." But Eric didn't laugh. He leaned closer, his eyes searching mine as if he was looking for a sign. "You mean more to me than just that," he whispered. I felt my breath catch. The small space of the Ferris wheel suddenly felt too tight, too intimate. "Eric, what are you saying?" He looked away, staring out at the horizon, as if gathering the courage to speak. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, I feel something when I'm with you. Something I can't ignore." I pulled back, feeling like I'd been splashed with cold water. This was my son. We shouldn't be having this conversation. I opened my mouth to speak, to put an end to this strange, dangerous line of thought, but the words wouldn't come. The ride ended, and I quickly stood up, forcing a smile. "Let's go find your dad," I said, my voice tight with forced cheerfulness. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to focus on the fun, on the simple joy of being together as a family, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I caught Eric's eyes on me several times, his gaze lingering in a way that made my skin tingle. And the worst part was, a small, hidden part of me didn't want him to look away. That night, we returned to the small cabin we had rented for the weekend. Dan was exhausted and went straight to bed, but Eric and I stayed up, sitting on the porch in silence, listening to the distant sound of crickets and the rustling of the leaves. "Mom," he said softly, breaking the silence. "I need to tell you something." I turned to look at him, but I could already feel where this conversation was going. "Eric, don't," I said, my voice shaky. "Whatever you're feeling, it's not." "I can't help it," he interrupted. "I know it's wrong. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I do. And I think you feel it too." I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Eric, this isn't right. I'm your mother." He reached out, gently taking my hand in his. "I know," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But when I look at you, I don't see just my mom. I see someone I can't stop thinking about. Someone I pulled my hand away, standing up abruptly. "No," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "You're confused. This is just a phase. You'll look back on this and realize it was a mistake." He stood too, closing the distance between us. What if it's not a mistake? What if this is the truest thing I've ever felt? Tears sprang to my eyes and I turned away, unable to face him. "We can't do this, Eric," I whispered. "We can't." He was silent for a long moment, and then he nodded, stepping back. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." I wiped away a tear, trying to compose myself. "Let's just go inside," I said. "It's late." As we walked back into the cabin, the weight of what had just happened hung heavily between us, like a fog we couldn't see through. I didn't know what the morning would bring, but I knew that our relationship would never be the same. We had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure there was any way back. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the cabin's thin curtains, casting soft golden lines across the room. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous night in my mind. It felt surreal, like a fever dream I couldn't quite shake. I could hear Dan snoring softly beside me, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that churned just outside the walls of our shared bedroom. I needed to get up, to find a moment alone to clear my head. Gently, I slipped out of bed and padded quietly into the kitchen. The air felt cool, and the familiar scent of the woods wafted in through the open window. I took a deep breath, trying to ground myself, but the moment my hand touched the countertop, a flood of emotion rushed back in. This was real. What happened last night wasn't a dream. As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard the soft creak of footsteps behind me. I turned to see Eric standing in the doorway, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. He seemed hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should step closer or turn away. "Morning," he said, his voice softer than usual, as if testing the waters. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound normal, but my voice came out strained, tight. I forced a smile, hoping it would bridge the gap between us, but it felt as fragile as a soap bubble. He took a step closer, then paused. "About last night." I cut him off, shaking my head. "Eric, let's not do this. It was late, we were both tired. We said things we didn't mean. Let's just forget it, okay?" But he didn't look away. His eyes were clear, earnest, and filled with a kind of determination that both frightened and stirred something deep inside me. "I can't forget it," he said quietly. "And I don't think you can either." I turned back to the counter, gripping the edge as if it could hold me steady. "We have to, Eric," I whispered. "There's no other choice." "You say that," he said, taking another step forward, "but I don't believe you." The sound of Dan stirring in the bedroom made us both freeze. I shot Eric a warning look, and he backed away, the tension between us coiling tighter. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, but then he just nodded and retreated to the living room. I felt the tears well up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. I had to keep it together, at least until we got home, and this whole trip was just a distant, uncomfortable memory. I heard Dan's footsteps behind me as he shuffled into the kitchen, yawning and oblivious to the storm brewing in the room. "Morning, sweetheart," he mumbled, wrapping his arms around me from behind. His embrace was warm, familiar, but it felt oddly distant, like there was a barrier between us that hadn't been there before. "Morning," I managed to reply, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. I was just about to make breakfast. The day dragged on slowly. We all made our way back to the amusement park, but the light-heartedness from the day before was gone. Every interaction with Eric felt loaded, as if we were both tiptoeing around a live wire, afraid to make the wrong move. Dan, bless him, was clueless, laughing and joking as if everything was perfectly fine. At one point, we stood in line for a ride, and I could feel Eric's eyes on me, watching me intently. I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze, and the look he gave me was so raw, so open, that it took my breath away. He looked like he was about to say something, but I quickly glanced away, pretending to be distracted by a group of kids running past us. I couldn't do this. Not here. Not with Dan right next to us. His arm casually slung around my shoulders as if we were just any normal family. The pressure of it all was suffocating. I wanted to run, to escape this twisted situation we'd found ourselves in, but there was no escape. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, I was exhausted. Dan suggested we head back to the cabin early, have a quiet dinner together and relax. I agreed quickly, desperate for an excuse to retreat into the safety of the small, familiar space, even though I knew it was anything but safe. Back at the cabin, I busied myself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a fervor that bordered on manic. I needed something to distract me, to keep my hands and mind occupied. Eric lingered nearby, not saying anything, but I could feel his presence like a physical weight pressing against my back. At one point, he moved closer, standing beside me at the counter. Our shoulders brushed, and I flinched as if burned. He pulled back slightly but didn't leave. "You're avoiding me," he said softly. So softly that I wasn't sure if Dan, who was sitting in the living room flipping through channels on the TV, could hear. "I'm not," I replied through gritted teeth, not daring to look up from the cutting board. "You are," he insisted, his voice laced with a quiet desperation. "And I get it. Do. But we can't ignore this forever." I set the knife down, my hands trembling. I turned to look at him, and the raw pain in his eyes broke something inside me. "We have to," I whispered fiercely. "This isn't right, Eric. It can't happen." Before he could respond, Dan called from the living room, asking what was taking so long. I took a deep breath, forced a smile onto my face, and turned away from Eric. "Dinner's almost ready," I called back, my voice unnaturally bright. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We ate in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of forks against plates and the occasional murmur of conversation from Dan. I couldn't look at Eric, couldn't risk meeting his eyes. Finally, when dinner was over, I excused myself to bed, claiming exhaustion. As I closed the bedroom door behind me, I felt the tears spill over, hot and bitter. I sank onto the bed, burying my face in my hands. What was I doing? How had things gotten this far? A soft knock on the door made me freeze. I didn't want to answer, didn't want to face him, but the door creaked open anyway. Eric stepped inside, closing it quietly behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, wiping at my tears. "No, we don't. We can't." But he didn't listen. He crossed the room in 3 quick steps, kneeling in front of me, taking my hands in his. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, don't push me away." I looked down at him, at the pain and longing etched across his face, and something inside me snapped. I cupped his face in my hands, tears streaming down my cheeks. "Eric," I whispered back, my voice filled with a pain that matched his. "This is tearing me apart." "I know," he said, his own tears falling now. "It's tearing me apart too." In that moment, with the world reduced to just the two of us, I realized there was no easy way out. We were in too deep, caught in something that neither of us could untangle. And as he leaned in closer, his forehead resting against mine, I knew that everything had changed. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I could feel his breath against my skin, warm and unsteady. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs, and I realized I wasn't pulling away. I was leaning in, meeting him halfway, as if my body had already made a choice that my mind was too afraid to acknowledge. Eric's hands cupped my face, his touch gentle yet firm, like he was afraid I'd vanish if he let go. He tilted his head, and in that moment time seemed to stop. The only sound was the ragged, shared rhythm of our breathing. "This is wrong," I whispered, the words trembling on my lips even as I felt myself inching closer. "We can't do this." "I know," he replied, his voice hoarse with a mixture of pain and longing. "But I can't stop myself." Our lips met in a tentative, fleeting kiss, just the softest brush, as if testing the waters of something forbidden. The spark was instant, like electricity coursing through me, igniting a fire I hadn't felt in years. It was so different, so raw and desperate. I pulled back, gasping, but Eric's hands slid down to my shoulders, holding me in place. "Don't go," he pleaded, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my resolve crumble. I searched his face, looking for something that might pull me back from the edge, but all I found was the same tangled mess of emotions that churned inside me. I knew this was a line we couldn't uncross, but I couldn't deny the way my heart raced or the way his touch made every nerve in my body come alive. "I've felt this way for so long," Eric confessed, his forehead pressing against mine. "And I thought I could ignore it, push it down, but I can't. Not anymore." Tears pricked my eyes and I shook my head, even as I leaned into his touch. "You don't mean that," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You're just confused. You don't understand what this could do to us." "I do understand," he insisted, his grip tightening slightly. "And I don't care. I've never felt this way about anyone, Mom. It's like I'm drawn to you, and it's terrifying, but it's real." I couldn't find words to argue. Every rational thought had fled, replaced by a heady mix of fear, guilt, and something darker, a desire I had never imagined feeling, especially not for my own son. But it was there, undeniable and insistent, like a tidal wave I couldn't hold back. Eric leaned in again, his lips brushing mine with a slow, deliberate pressure that melted the last of my defenses. This time I kissed him back. It wasn't gentle. It was hungry, filled with all the pent-up tension and forbidden need we'd both tried so hard to bury. His hands tangled in my hair, and I felt his body pressing closer, his need as palpable as my own. I pulled away abruptly, gasping for air, my hands clutching his shoulders as if to steady myself. "We have to stop," I managed to say, though even to my own ears it sounded weak, like I didn't really mean it. He shook his head, his eyes dark with something I couldn't name. "No," he whispered. "I don't want to stop. Please don't make me stop." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and he brushed it away with his thumb, the gentleness of the gesture making my heart ache. "This isn't about what we want," I said, trying to regain some semblance of control. "It's about what's right." "What if this is right?" he asked, his voice so quiet it was almost a breath. "What if this is the only thing that's ever felt right?" I couldn't answer him. My head was spinning, the world tilting off its axis, and the only solid thing in my universe was Eric. I closed my eyes, pressing my forehead against his, trying to find the strength to pull away, to end this before it went any further. But then his lips found mine again, insistent and needy, and I felt my resolve shatter into a million pieces. I kissed him back hard, gripping the fabric of his shirt as if it could anchor me to reality. His hands roamed my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us, just the heat of our bodies and the thundering beat of our hearts. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against my lips, but his hands were still moving, exploring the curve of my waist, the small of my back. "Tell me you don't want this, and I will." But I couldn't say it. I couldn't lie, not anymore. I let out a shuddering breath and whispered, "I don't want you to stop." The words hung in the air like a confession, and in that instant, something broke free inside both of us. Eric's hand slid under the hem of my shirt, his touch tentative, almost reverent, as if he was afraid I'd change my mind. I arched into his touch, a soft gasp escaping my lips, and that was all the encouragement he needed. He lifted me up effortlessly, carrying me over to the bed. I clung to him, burying my face in his neck, inhaling the scent of him. Familiar yet somehow new, intoxicating. He laid me down gently, hovering above me, his eyes searching mine one last time for any sign of hesitation. But I didn't hesitate. I pulled him down, capturing his lips with mine in a kiss that felt like both a surrender and a victory. It was slow at first, almost gentle, but the undercurrent of urgency quickly took over. My hands roamed his back, pulling him closer, feeling the solid strength of him, the way his body fit against mine so perfectly. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice rough and strained, like he was holding on to the last thread of his self-control. "Yes," I breathed, The single word filled with all the longing and fear and need I'd been holding back for so long. Yes. And then we were lost, swept up in a tide of emotions that neither of us could control or deny. It was desperate, raw, filled with a kind of intensity one had never experienced before. I knew it was wrong, that the consequences would be devastating, but in that moment, all I could feel was the overwhelming rightness of being with him, the sense that this was where I was meant to be. When it was over, we lay there in silence, the only sound our ragged breathing as we tried to catch our breath. Eric's arm was wrapped around me, holding me close, as if he was afraid I'd slip away. I turned to look at him, and the look in his eyes was so filled with love, with relief and fear and everything in between, that I felt my heart twist painfully in my chest. "What have we done?" I whispered, my voice cracking. He kissed my forehead, pulling me closer. "Something we can't take back," he said softly. "But I don't regret it." Neither did I. And that was the most terrifying realization of all.
Bye.